So it seems that we've got a surprise Warhammer 40k datasheet unveiled, new rules for fielding their unique Nemesis claw in a Chaos Space Marine army, and it seems they have a rather disturbing datasheet ability that debuffs stratagems like basically no other in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Night Lords, and in this video I thought we'd talk briefly about the Kill Team Nemesis Claw and the Warhammer 40k rules that Games Workshop have unveiled for them. Let's briefly talk about Night Lords in general, their representation on the tabletop and the Nemesis Claw kit, and then go through the datasheet, war gear and all its special rules, and how it looks like they're stacking up against the rest of the Heretic Astartes on the tabletop. The Night Lords are one of the many Space Marine legions that followed Horus during the Horus Heresy, though perhaps were already a force that was kind of off the rails before that, having the good fortune to be under the care of Primarch Conrad Kurz of Nostromo, growing up on a horrendous crime-ridden world and basically taking it upon himself to be a vigilante killer, enforcing discipline and peace through sheer terror, and enacting horrendous bloody revenge on any that should disrupt his rule. The Night Lords certainly embrace this way of life, fighting with terror tactics and brutality, striking from the shadows in lightning-wreathed armour, bat-winged helms, and having an unpleasant tendency to want to flay the skin off their victims, often utilising a great number of raptors to strike from the shadowy skies. They're entirely happy to attack weaker foes, have absolutely zero mercy in victory, and post the death of Kurz and the Horus Heresy, the Legion has had a self-destructive and vengeance-driven tone, revelling in cruelty, carnage, and destroying things in the Imperium whenever it's possible to do so, and having a loose allegiance with the Chaos Gods at best. In any case, not really the sort of people we want to get on the wrong side of. In 40k, the non-deity traitor legions haven't really received all that much in terms of unique models or releases. The Night Lords had a couple of pretty old Chaos Lord models. I think the bat-winged helms and things hadn't really aged too well. They were taken out of rotation a while back, but then in Kill Team Nightmare they got a surprise new update. Games Workshop adding an upgrade sprue to the regular Chaos Legionary kit and coming out with the Nemesis Claw, one of the best received kill teams they've released so far, and kind of surprising that was an upgrade sprue one. In general, the upgrade sprue ones for a lot of other factions tend to be a little bit whatever, but I think they work particularly well with the Night Lords, as just to make them what they are, you just want some nice helmed, a bunch of flame skin, and some customised weapons, and it really changes the look and feel of the kit. Here's the pictures of the upgrade sprues if you're interested, a bunch of nice flaying chain swords, a great big chain glaive, plenty of themed helms and legion symbols, plus the icon banner thing which has half a Space Marine attached to it as an all rather grisly standard bearer. There's quite a lot of fun detailed things, including the guy with the venomous blade and the sort of mini-me Kurz off to the left there, fighting with his pair of lightning claws. The kit took a long time to be released individually, and Games Workshop is selling it for $75, £46 or €60, though it seems there was so much pent-up demand for the Night Lords players that it's now temporarily out of stock at time of recording. I think it was quite nice that they managed to add this much interest to the Legionary kit with an upgrade sprue. I'm sure to be welcomed quite a lot if they did that for the other non-deity legions to give them more personality. And to be honest, I wasn't really expecting them to release any 40k rules for it. Usually if they do that, it tends to come out when the actual launch box comes out. For this one it didn't, so a lot of people were just running them as Legionaries with a rough sort of proxy. But then yesterday, out of the blue, they just dropped the datasheet, which appears just to have turned up on the Warhammer 40k downloads page. I couldn't see anywhere that it was announced that, obviously. And this one gives us a full datasheet for the Night Lords kill team, complete with points cost. Before we jump into the datasheet, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Tech, makers of some mechy carry cases that have a Kickstarter running at the moment, basically launching and upgrading their range of clip-in carry cases to transport miniatures around in safety. To do that, they have a system of components, which I'll show a few of them working on screen at the moment. The idea is that they have little plastic grippy things that can hold onto bases, securing models to surfaces in a similar sort of way to how you might with magnets, but without actually having to magnetize the miniatures to the surfaces, and they're all fairly simple and satisfying to use. Their current range were these mechy slider cases, good for a small to medium sized force as you can see here. The one they're launching on the Kickstarter though are sort of upgraded versions of those, called Mechy Plus cases with the clear plastic front and storage compartment at the top of them. They have ones like this one that can fit any 40k combat patrol, and at Kickstarter prices where I checked it looks like they're $65, £51 or €61, plus different sizes for different options as well. I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video if you're interested, but otherwise there'll be links down in the video description below. Getting back to those Night Lords though, taking a look at the datasheet for them, they're a new unit for the Chaos Space Marines. The flavour text says that Nemesis claws are squads of Night Lords consumed by murderlust and sadism, employed by terror troops by Chaos Warlords the galaxy over. You can basically add them to any Chaos Space Marine army, maybe not feeling so very different from how you might add Cult Marines of, say, Khorne Berserkers or Plague Marines. And I guess for armies that don't have a Night Lords aesthetic and don't want to mix legions, I guess you could always just convert up some of your Legionaries to have some appropriate war gear and run them as these guys if you like. In any case, they certainly feel more like veteran Marines, as they're not battle line and they only have OC1. And the points cost for them is 5 models for 110 or 10 models for 190. It does seem that Games Workshop's trying to roughly go off the Legionary points cost for those. They're either 90 points or 170 per 10 of them at the moment, so a bit of a discount if you field them in larger squads, and they're basically 20 points more than Legionaries whether you take them as a larger or small unit. For keyword things, they also have Psychers, which I guess is for their visionary leader. I guess Night Lords having some premonitions of the future seems to give them the Psyker keyword for that. And characters can attach to them as if they were Legionaries, so have a fair few options for that. Perhaps most importantly the Chaos Lord, which tends to be the one that gets used with Legionaries far more than anything else does. Taking a look at their base stats next, they are basically the same as the Chaos Legionaries for their normal stats. Toughness 4 with 2 wounds and a 3+ save as per standard Space Marines. Leadership 6 but only OC1 rather than OC2, so they won't have quite as much presence on objectives versus the rank and file Chaos Marines. For shooting damage they will be a little bit tougher than the Legionaries though, at least per model, not necessarily per point, as they get the stealth keyword, which means they'll be -1 to hit at range, which certainly helps out a bit. Then the unit basically gets representations for all the things that you'd field with the Nemesis Claw loadout. The base squad is armed with bolters and can swap it out to chainsaws like standard Legionaries can. I think that does make sense for any spare ones that you might have, though to be honest they're going to be a minority within the unit. I think you have 7 of them to take special upgrades, so it's only going to be 3 models even if you take a squad of 10, and if you take a 5 model squad it's going to be no basic guys at all. Otherwise you get 1 special weapon per squad, a Melter Plasma or Flamer. I like to go for the Melter or Plasma there, though there might be some decisions as to take between that and melee weapons in a smaller squad. The Visionary gets a Plasma Pistol, which you may as well take. At worst you can just resist the urge to overcharge if you really don't want to risk losing the Power Fist at a key moment. And then for every 10 models in the squad you can either take a Missile Launcher or Heavy Bolter. Both are kind of okay, though probably not the single most preferred heavy weapon that you might be able to take. I'd say the Missile Launcher might be a little bit more tempting, given that you get sustained hits on the Heavy Bolter, which doesn't synergize quite as well with Dark Pats. I think in reality though, either of them are fine, certainly worth it in a 10-man squad for a free upgrade. They do have some shooting presence, though I feel like it's not really the biggest part of them, and they have a bit more threat in melee. Speaking of which, they do have a bit more interesting stuff here. They do have some trade-offs versus Legionaries. The Visionary gets a Power Fist, which seems to be the sensible choice. As per normal in 40k, having big strength and higher damage is better, though you do get the option of that fun sort of ribcage chainsword. It's labelled as a Nostraman Chainblade, basically a chainsword with 5 attacks and sustained hits 1. Certainly able to go through some chaff infantry a little bit faster with that if you did want to use it as models. Then for the rest of the unit you basically get 3 other AP2 damage 1 power weapons of different sorts. One gets an accursed weapon, so 4 attacks at strength 5 AP2 damage 1. One gets a Nostraman Chain Glaive, which is basically a bigger, heavier version. That's 4 attacks at strength 8 AP2 and damage 1 with sustained hits. So fairly punchy there. It's a tiny bit behind the heavy melee weapon if it's attacking against damage 2 targets, but it's better against other things, so that one's definitely worth including at a squad of every size I think. And then there's one for paired accursed weapons, so lightning claws basically, 4 attacks at strength 5 AP2 damage 1, but getting twin linked for a few more wound rolls. It basically makes sense to take one of each at a 10-man squad. At a 5-man squad it's going to be the trade-off between dropping one of these or the special weapon. I feel like you want the cool stratagem debuff rule that we'll get to in a second, so I guess you'd either be losing the one accursed weapon or the special weapon, whether you want to kit your squad for a little bit more range or a little bit more melee, in addition to the more auto-take things like the chain glaive, paired accursed weapons and the power fist. Next up, their unit special rule is a damage dealing one, maybe having a little bit of parity with the Legionaries, which also get one of those too. These guys basically get +1 to hit against units that are below starting strength, and then +1 to wound units that are below half strength. Out of those two, I'd focus far more on the +1 to hit. The +1 to wounds are going to be all very nice, but you're not really going to be able to control which units they can attack below half strength. It's not going to be active most of the time. But then the +1 to hit is quite a nice boost. They'll be hitting on 2s rather than 3s, and that applies to both range and melee as well. And I guess it adds a bit more emphasis to trying to chip at least some damage off their target before they charge it, hopefully with something kind of opportunistic. though it is kind of annoying as the buff is alright but not really so good that you'd really want to change your shooting patterns too much. In theory, the +1 to hit's usually going to be a 25% damage boost against your target, but in reality if they're using Dart Patch to get some sustained hits or fun stuff on some of their other weapons, it's going to be even less than that. It basically doesn't feel quite as easy to trigger versus the Legionaries wound rerolls of 1, which is on automatically, and then full wound rerolls, which is great, and against things on objectives, which is pretty predictable, and doesn't really help out characters quite as much. Though I guess it could be okay on a Demon Hammer Chaos Lord, making them hit on a 2+ rather than the 3 they get. Overall, it's definitely not unhelpful, though it's kind of annoying that it needs a bit of setup, or to be happening to be attacking units that are already damaged. Out of everything though, I feel like the single biggest selling point of the squad is this rather interesting voice eater ability. Initially wasn't 100% sure what bit of war gear this was, but it turns out it's basically the guy with the half Space Marine on the banner. It's essentially a bit of war gear that you can take, so you'd have to swap out one thing. It means that for him though, he can only take the Astartes chainsword, so it isn't so much damage for him personally. What it does though is actually a surprisingly powerful stratagem debuff. When any units besides monsters and vehicles are within engagement range of the unit, they can't use any stratagems at all. It does have its limitations, not being able to affect everything is kind of annoying, and being in engagement range is going to be a little bit harder to make it work, given that there might be things that they either can't afford to stay in combat with, or charging would be a very bad idea. But I feel like it's really quite cool that it isn't just take a battle shock test and potentially stop stratagems, it's just flat turn them off when they're within engagement. You stop things like command point rerolls, epic challenge, or interrupting for many units, and all manner of damage, defense, and fights on death type ones if you wanted to. I'll cycle back to this a little bit later, but it does feel like it might be the single biggest selling point for them, and does something that other units just don't. Overall, to sum them up briefly though, for 110 points or 190 points, the Nemesis Claw are an infantry unit that's somewhat equivalent to Legionaries in a lot of ways. They do make some trade-offs, including lesser objective control, and a slightly worse damage roll, and cost a bit more, but their major advantages are that they gain stealth, so harder to kill at range. They do have their own damage rule, which is still a fairly good one, and particularly against critically injured units on the few times that you get to attack those. Most of the squad can take special gear of some sort, so perhaps compete better at a 10-man squad versus a 5-man. And their biggest selling point I think is turned off stratagems in melee, something that I don't think anyone else has got in 40k. For downsides, they really are quite pricey for a unit of 5, they don't have good defense for the cost. The turn off stratagems thing not working against vehicles is going to make it worse in some matchups. The damage buff isn't as easy to trigger as you want it to be, and they basically have some very direct competitors where they're going to get compared to Legionaries and Chosen and decided whether or not they're worth it. It does mean though that they're likely to be using the same sort of buffs and synergies that Legionaries and Chosen do, and for Chaos Space Marines that tends to be going in one way quite a lot. They'll get their army-wide dart packs plus any detachment rules to increase damage. Getting lethal hits on all of those mid-strength AB2 things can help them punch up against vehicles and stuff, though they don't get an icon to re-roll this unfortunately. I feel like the most tempting place to run them would be with a Chaos Lord and Inner Rhino to deliver them into the fight, in a similar way to how Legionaries and Chosen squads often tend to get used. I feel like they fit into the sort of category somewhere between the two of those units. They're sort of weakest durability, but being quite a big threat with the Lord attached means that they're worth the transport to get them somewhere safely and give them an extra 3-inch charge threat range once they get out. For detachments, I was interested to see if they'd have any good synergy with the Dread Talons and the Night Lords more themed detachments. It's not one of the ones that gets used in competitive play unfortunately, basically playing kind of like Chaos Knights with the aura of extra battle shock tests and taking those tests at -1. I guess you could cause a little bit more terror by stopping the enemy using insane bravery if they needed to, and I guess stratagems that could help them could be the fall back and charge one. Catch up with an enemy that's fallen back within 6 inches to potentially lock them in melee and still prevent stratagems, and there's a few damage dealers that can work better against units that are battle shocked. I feel like they're a unit that's not unhelpful with the detachment, being an aggressive melee infantry one, but maybe don't feel like they're particularly supported more so than a bunch of the other infantry damage dealers, or things like jump infantry which have a few focus strats. Otherwise though, for more mainstream Chaos Space Marine lists, it tends to be Renegade Raiders that are most played. I certainly enjoy some of the transport stratagems like reroll wound rolls out of transports, which I guess could be interesting versus Legionaries there, given that the Legionaries could already get that. And the other detachment things such as an advance and charge stratagem and the detachment rule for AP against objectives and the Armour of Contempt equivalent are all useful enough. Otherwise, I guess they could go pact bound and take Chaos Mark, so that feels kind of wrong for Night Lords given how much they dislike the Chaos Gods in their own way. I guess Undivided could be another source of reroll wound rolls with a Chaos Lord and make the unit very fighty, or Slanesh could have them advance and charge, plus they get the boosted Dark Pacts of course, and then Veterans of the Long War could help them out with Focus of Hatred, the Armor of Contempt equivalent, or the reactive moves. Basically lots of things has good synergy with them given that they're similar to Legionaries. Talking of which though, it does really feel like they're going to be the primary competition, 20 points less for a similar sort of squad, getting a Power Fist on the Sergeant, one special or heavy weapon per 5 models, and then another heavy melee weapon per 5 models in the squad, so you could get a fair bit more damage too out of them. For advantages versus disadvantages, Legionaries do have quite a lot going for them. They're 20 points cheaper whether it's the smaller or bigger squad. The damage buff I'd say is probably a bit better just due to being easier to activate. I'd say the melee weapons are somewhat balanced. The Legionaries get more damage 2 ones, but the Night Lords get more damage 1 at a bigger squad. The Legionaries get a better choice of heavy weapons and can take them in the smaller size squad if they want to. They can reroll Dark Pacts with their Chaos Icon, which is kind of helpful and helps prevent mortal wounds. OC2 is great for their battlefield role, scrapping over mid-board objectives most likely. You can field more Legionaries with Battle Line, and they don't get the Psycho keyword, which is usually a disadvantage. I'd say that reroll wound rolls is slightly better on attached characters, more so than the +1 to hit potential. For direct benefits for the Nemesis Claw, stealth is certainly one of them, otherwise preventing stratagems when locked in melee really feels like the single biggest selling point, given that the damage buff is alright but harder to trigger. Overall it does feel like a win for the Legionaries besides that one rule, so it's really weighing up whether or not that rule is worth taking the downsides and the higher points cost. I'm not going to focus on them so much for this one, but they're also competing against Chosen as well for an elite guard. I'd certainly say the 5-man squad unit definitely doesn't do so well in raw stats against the Chosen. They're basically 15 points more but get far more accursed melee weapons. Built-in advanced shoot and charge is rather nice, as is a Chaos Icon. So again with the Chosen you really have to have that stratagem debuff rule be very relevant if you're taking them over these guys. For overall first impressions, I do think it's just kind of fun and interesting to get some bespoke rules for a Night Lords kill team in the first place. It wasn't something I was necessarily expecting, and it's quite a nice little flavour win I think. There's absolutely nothing to stop you running them as standard Legionaries as you might have done before. I guess this one's nice enough if you happen to have assembled them for actual kill team though, with all the specialist models that you can see on the box art. It means that you can have those bits of war gear meshed directly onto profiles rather than doing some slightly awkward proxying. Otherwise though, as I've said a few times, I think the only major selling point for the competitive play is that preventing stratagems rule, which is kind of awkward in that it could be absolutely godly in the right situations. Say if it stops the opponent interrupting and their unit gets killed as a result, if it stops them fighting on death with a big unit that you're just about to wipe out with the Chaos Lord and the Night Lord's damage output, if you stop Armor of Contempt or command point rerolls on a key character that's about to die, or as mentioned things like Insane Bravery, if they desperately wanted to do that just before they try and back out of combat. My first instincts are that it's probably not quite going to be worth it to tempt the vast majority of people to use this datasheet over other things, even if it is really fun. I just think that you're giving up really quite a lot just versus the base Legionary datasheet, never mind the fact that these are 20 points more, and you could be potentially losing a fair bit of damage output, paying more cost, and in plenty of games not really having it come up. If you say happen to be facing an army that's mainly monsters and vehicles for a game, then it's not going to matter. Or say if it just winds up that you've just charged a unit, wiped them out, and then get shot down in return. It just feels like a rule that's going to matter big in a small minority of games, but really not come up and wish that you'd taken Legionaries in some of the others. I definitely think they're more interesting than they could have been though. At least they do have one genuine selling point that makes them actually interesting and do something very different for the Chaos Army, and maybe they'll find some people having a go with them at more high levels of play. I feel like that's the sort of rule that might matter more at the top ends of big tournaments, with people trying to do all sorts of clever shenanigans to outwit each other, as opposed to maybe the average 40k player who could probably just do more damage and defense and not worry too much about a rule that might come up in only a few games. Let me know what you think of them though. Do you rate the Nemesis Claw or not for their 40k rules? Finally, I just cycle back to the Tabletop Tech Mechie carry cases that I mentioned earlier in the video. As mentioned, they're the video sponsor. The idea being that you hold a bunch of miniatures in small grippy components to protect them from harm as you go carrying them around the place. The Kickstarter looks like it's been really quite popular this time around. Seems it was funded within literally minutes and now there's about $60,000 worth pledged, so a few people look like they're giving them a go. As mentioned, they use that component system to grip onto models' bases earlier in the video, and I feel like that system does have some pros and cons perhaps, maybe being better for certain armies that are likely to stay the same way for a while, say if you've got a stable 1000 point list or you play Combat Patrol. for those kind of purposes. They certainly do have cases that are big enough for 2,000 point armies if you've got a consistent one, and you can swap the components about if you do want to change the setup. In general, they look rather nice, feel fairly polished and satisfying to use. A similar sort of appeal to magnets and things, except no need to attach the magnets to the bases if that's something that you don't want to do for your collection. For potential negatives and criticisms I've seen about the internet, I saw a few people use the word over-engineered, maybe being a little bit less speedy to get things in and out versus some other solutions due to having to operate each individual small component. They do feel at least kind of satisfying to use though, and I feel like that'd be less of a problem at smaller points levels versus really big armies. And perhaps the other one is they're not quite as flexible as some options once they're already set up. You would need to have the right module component things for your right bases. So if you wind up adding new units that have different size bases, it'd wind up meaning that you need to buy some more components and things. Plus if you like to change your army all the time, you'd have to swap those components in and out of the case, which at least takes a little effort. All transport systems do have their pros and cons though, and certainly seems they do have a bunch of people who've opted to go for this one. In any case, they've got a few options in their range. They've got a combat patrol style case which has 6 modules on it, designed to be able to handle any Warhammer 40k combat patrol force. They've got some fun monster cases as well, which could be one way to transport a prize awkwardly shaped creation. I feel like greater demons and demon primarchs and things tend to be a bit of a nightmare to transport no matter how you do them. And they do have plenty of other options, both bigger and smaller than that, smaller kill team ones or a big one that's aimed at a 2,000 point army. This one's their 24 model, and as you can see they've managed to fit in a good amount of Crimson Fist in that one, a whole bunch of tanks, infantry and dreadnoughts and stuff. In any case, you'll find their Kickstarter links down in the video description, feel free to check them out, and thank you to them for sponsoring the video. In any case, I'll leave that one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly cover any Games Workshop's news or updates as they come out. Feel free to check the other bits out in the video description. There's the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support there, and the various discount links for buying models online. As always, a big thank you to anyone supporting the channel through those. But otherwise, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.